Lepo pozdravljeni ponovno. Danes bomo ta pogovor izvedli v angleščini, tako da upam, da boste vse razumeli. I would like to thank Nina Bunjevac for being with us today. Due to the circumstances, unfortunately, she was not able to join us in person, but she joined us live via Zoom already yesterday with the lecture at Academy for Arts. And today we're having her also on Zoom. I hope you have prepared some questions for her since she's one of our main international guests this year. Nina, I would like to greet you. It's you're very welcome to join us, via internet here at Kino Šiška. I hope everything is okay with you.
Everything is, and I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm very sorry I couldn't be there in person. I couldn't help it. I had a flood in the apartment, and I have to make sure that, paper and water don't get along, and I have to keep watch over my art. So thank you for understanding.
Of course. Since even these 45 minutes will be much too little for us to speak about all of your work, I would still like to begin with how did you actually ended up in comics, since you were first drawing illustrations, then you did the sculpture installations. How is it that you went after sculpturing into the comics?
Well, first I worked as a painter, mainly working oil on canvas. And every time I would produce a painting, people would comment that I was an illustrator more than an artist. So eventually I realized that I should do illustration. But after a slight detour of working in sculpture, or rather sculpture installation, whereas I would arrange objects within the space, I realized that what I was actually doing with the objects was weaving a story, or rather, the story would begin to emerge from the placement of either these dolls that I was making or found objects that I would refurbish, and that these objects themselves became components of a larger story within that. At this time, I was not feeling the painting anymore. I was no longer inspired to paint. And to track back a little bit, since I grew up in former Yugoslavia and moved back to Canada at the age of 16, my command of the English language was quite poor. Before I left Yugoslavia, one of my aims was to also study journalism. So from somebody who really enjoyed writing, I found myself in a new country where I spoke no language, and therefore I couldn't really express myself in that way. That is until I realized, after taking a course at the Ontario College of Art and Design in creative writing, that writing is really storytelling, and that what I was looking at, or rather occupied by, was proper grammar, how to string the right words within a sentence. But what I failed to see was that no matter how you write, you need to communicate a story. And if you can communicate a story by talking the way that we are talking right now, then you can write, and you can write in a very simple language. So from sculpture installation, I realized that with these stories beginning to emerge, that I was beginning to feel that these stories need to be expanded upon. At this same time in Canada, where I have been living, Chester Brown's Louis Riel was published. Some years before that, Art Spiegelman's Mouse, then Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis. We had Debbie Dreschler, Phoebe Lochner. The term graphic novel began to emerge, so the comics seem to have grown up. and with it, the types of stories that were being told. So I decided to start experimenting with comics inspired by the titles that I just mentioned. And that was the beginning of the story of the comics.
Your work is based on real stories, and your artwork is very realistic. Is this somehow connected one with other, or did you find your style of drawing before you started with the stories?
I think I equally experimented and developed both. If you look at my first book, which is a collection of my first short comics, Heartless, each story has a different technique. And you can see in it that over the period of 8 years that it took to produce these stories, I kept looking and searching for the right technique. And I think that in that first book, the story that comes closest to where I would go later on is the story about Torvald and Nora, which I believe is the real deal. So at the same time, I was developing my writing style. Again, it was something that happened organically, and I think is still happening. I think that any artist, as long as they're alive, keeps changing and evolving their style. So I would say it's been happening for both, and it will probably continue going that way.
Are you thinking a lot about the way the light is falling on your characters, on your pictures? Because it seems like, especially with lightning and with your pointillistic shadowing, you are special in this way. So how important is actually light to you?
Light is everything, everything. I can't emphasize how important light is. Thinking about where the rays come from, where they would fall onto the object, how they would reflect. That's everything. In a way, when you look at a black and white drawing, the white of the paper symbolizes light, the totality of light, while the ink, black ink, symbolizes the absence of light. So it really is a play of light and shadow drawing, for me at least. And I think it's working because because there is something to piece that is done correctly when light is concerned that gives it extra life and that our eyes can pick up on.
So when we're talking about the way you're drawing, yesterday you emphasized that it is important to draw very good originals. Because you said you were selling your originals or not. Actually, most of your finances come from selling originals right now. So I'm wondering, are you really concerned about this all the time, or are you still working maybe with some pens that aren't so good, but you still maybe prefer it now to ink that would maybe last longer on the paper?
I work that way with anything I do, whether it's an illustration for a magazine or a book or my own comic. It's very important for me to use materials that will last because as you've mentioned, the biggest part of my income is selling the originals from my books. And out of respect for the collector, I feel obliged to give them something that will not fall apart within several years. I remember I was in Angoulême during my year-long residence, and I met a Spanish cartoonist, Lola Lorente, who told me how she worked at an archives for comics, and after 10 years, a drawing that is made with like those pilot pens, those fine liners, and liquid paper would just fall apart. Basically, the black would turn purple or even yellow, and the liquid paper will crumble up, become dust, and just fall off. And that image, I think I blame Lola for that, because I can't stop thinking about it every time I draw. But again, there's something about natural materials, using gouache, using ink, and using paper. It's like the same as, wanting to wear something made out of wool, as opposed to fleece, made out of plastic bottles.
So how important it is? You are very fine in, you have small details and everything. How important is the preparation for comic? How does your preparation look like? What is behind the scenes?
You were probably more concerned with the approach to the drawing itself, right? I make sure to have the sketches. Okay, I begin with sketching on the paper with pencils. I will then I will retrace the drawing onto tracing paper, and then I will turn over the paper, because sometimes I will see a mistake that my eye wouldn't register otherwise. So it's the old Renaissance trick of looking in a mirror to check for what needs to be corrected in the piece. Several times I'll turn over the piece of the tracing paper, and when I'm finally done, I will scan it in Photoshop, and I will resize it if it needs to be resized. I will edit, print it out, and then this line work, so we're only having outlines, will be traced on the light table or the window, onto harder piece of paper, heavier stock paper. Now, the printout that I use to trace out, I will shade with pencil, and then I will figure out where the shadow is, where the reflective light is, and everything. So that will be my reference for the final drawing.
What about storyboards? Do you do storyboard?
No, I've never done storyboards, simply because I work. My approach to writing is kind of like delegate some activities to the right brain. So do some automatic drawing, automatic writing, come up with some images. That is like once the idea is born for a book or whatever. And then I will switch the function to the left brain, and will do the editing. I will look at the material that I already have, and I will assess whether or not it's going somewhere. Is there a direction? Is it going, and what needs to be added? What's the next step? So I would say that way I would produce about 3 penciled pages at a time, and then I'll proceed to ink it. And while I'm inking these pages, I'm already thinking about where the story is going next. So I tried working with storyboard, and I failed miserably. I'm just not the left brain person, so couldn't do it. No.
Okay, but where, for example, since you're an illustrator as well, I was wondering, where do you see if there is a line between when the illustrations stop and comics begin? Because you have also some comics such as Bezimena or Reparations that have like this big one-page illustration, but it's still a comic book.
I think there's a very fine line. I think that any good illustration is meant to tell a story. That's what really an illustration is, whether it's for the magazine or a book. If you remember when you were a kid and you were looking at pictures in picture books, it's like it's an entirely different world. Like you don't have to even read the book to weave a story out of it. So I try to make the drawings interesting enough that people can read different things into them. the sequential art, what comics are, they're sequential art, and sequential art is basically a combination of the text and art, but it doesn't always have to be text. It's sequential art. So the Reparation, the last book, it has 25 pages, no text. The way that Franz Messerel made his woodcuts to tell the story through images. So I'm a firm believer that you can tell an entire story just through pictures, kind of like The Arrival, the book. Yeah.
Talking about pictures made me think also about photography. I was wondering whether you are inspired by photography, especially when I was reading Fatherland. It seems like you were inspired with this newspaper photography because it seems like a bit old, maybe like done with Xerox or something. Were you inspired by that?
I love old photography, black and white photography. I love the fact that photographs before the digital age could capture a moment of time that you couldn't really get prepared for very well. I remember my favorite part of working on Fatherland was scanning the family photos and zooming in and noticing details that told me so much. For example, there was a picture of my grandmother. She was holding a rabbit. Her sister was rather holding a rabbit, and my grandmother was holding my father as a baby. It was a beautiful little photograph, and the face of my grandmother was dodged, so it was very white and it lacked detail. And I always wondered why the photographer did it in the lab. But when I zoomed in and I corrected the levels of the photograph, I realized that she had a black eye, that her husband was beating her so much that he had given her a black eye. So these are the details that you can't really get anywhere else. I mean, I call it the archaeology of, of going through archival footage or photographs or whatnot.
Is the archaeology actually your process of work? Because you were actually drawing the time when you were already alive, but you probably have no memory of. So, how did you recreate those moments?
You're right. It was like archaeology because I had to combine the stories that were told to me by my grandparents, by my mother, my great aunt, my sister, together with the articles. For example, in Fatherland, I found quite a few articles about people in question within the organization that my father belonged to. I was able to also look at historical facts at the time. And when you put everything together, it's like a piece, like a puzzle beginning to come together, that's made up on different levels. So personal level, collective level, whether it's within the family, within the country, or the region at the time.
Since Fatherland, if you haven't read it, is talking about your father who was part of a terroristic group that was working in Canada, and it's talking about Serbian nationalism. Now you are living again in Serbia. And did you maybe had any problems because it sort of seems you're quite objective while you're talking in the book while you're narrating the story, but in at the same time probably in Serbia this can be understood also as a criticism towards the country. So you maybe had some problems in Serbia because of that.
Never. It's surprisingly, it's a very chill place, especially in the south. People are extremely friendly. Haven't met many people who are concerned with that part of the history. I think, and I have a sneaking suspicion that people who do live in diaspora. So these are Serbs in North America who are still kind of stuck in the World War II. I mean, there are people who look at, those days with nostalgia here, but I've never had a problem in Serbia with that. But I did have a problem in Canada where I received a letter from an organization called Ravna Gora, I believe, and it was a Chetnik organization, the royalist organization that ran out of Hamilton, Ontario, and they were very angry that because of one sentence in which it described the General Draža Mihailović as having collaborated with the Axis during the World War II. So that's really the only thing, and they didn't really go beyond their blog because they published the letter to me, and then they published my answer to them, which was that was quite a few years ago, I believe, 2015 maybe. But no, like I'm quite surprised how chill it is in Serbia now. I think people have just moved on. They're just tired of the same politics. They just want to survive and have a decent life.
So since you've always been connected with Serbian alternative comics scene and you're back now, do you see maybe some change in the last couple of decades in Serbian comic scene?
I do. I see, for example, I had been in touch with Matriarchia and who printed some of my posters, and they seem to be doing the same thing, but they've totally cleaned up their act. They have a beautiful studio and they're like very organized. I have not gotten to see them yet. I saw Alexander Zograf and his wife Gordana. He's still doing his thing. And to me, if Zograf is still alive and well and doing his thing, things are okay.
And if you would compare Serbian comic scene to Canadian comic scene, what do you find most different and what is actually similar between two?
I think that the Serbian comic scene has more of like a collective feeling to it. It's more of like getting together and drinking and smoking and talking and drawing. There's more of that feeling of, there's a tradition already at the level of grassroots level. For example, if you look at Vostok and Zlata, they're still doing the same type of comics with the same type of a feeling, which is wonderful to see. Zograf, the way I said, like he's still doing his thing. What I notice is that people here also, they widen their lens of interest. So it's not just comics. It's like not comics names, but they're very much interested in other things. And I think the only author in Canada that I know that does that is Chester Brown. I see a lot of Canadian comic scene doesn't have that feeling of, there are comic jams, but it doesn't have that feeling of, we're building something together, out of nothing. I think what happens is that people eventually become published and move away. And for example, I've been living in Canada for 33 years, and I have more friends in Serbia and Croatia and Italy and Slovenia who are in comics than in Canada.
Do we maybe have at this point already some questions from the audience? I will just jump down.
Yes.
Do you need the microphone? We got another microphone.
Uh-huh.
Hello, Nina.
Maybe
Hello.
you can say your name so she knows who
Yes.
she's talking to.
Hi,
She can see you. Yeah.
I'm Milanka.
Hi,
I've been-
Milanka.
Yes, I've been to your lecture also yesterday, and my question sprung up from yesterday's thoughts that you said. And you said that after the La Réparation, you had the feeling that you told everything there was to say, like personal stories. And how does that feel? I mean, do you feel empty or healed, or what's the feeling of completion after such massive, huge storytelling of your personal things?
Well, that's an interesting question because I think it's very important to mention that before I began working on the reparation, I entered Jungian psychoanalysis, and I was in it for 3 years. So I was, for the lack of better term, I was supervised while working on the most difficult of the topics in my personal life. Once I was finished with these stories, it took a little while for everything to settle because, again, you have psychoanalysis going at the same time. So I'm reaching a certain point in psychoanalysis where I'm feeling much better about my life and about myself and everything in general. Now I feel a sense of relief. That is, that there's a sense of freedom. When you have personal stories that need to be told, it's almost like it's like shadow material in Jungian analysis, where the more you repress it, the more danger there is that it will erupt somehow, somewhere, whether it will whether it affects your health or whether it comes out as this volcano of emotions. So I took everything out of myself, like all of these stories that needed to be told. Like basically, I did a lot of soul mining. And after telling these stories, the stories were out. The analysis was over, and I just felt like, okay, what do I do next? And fortunately, before the reparation, I had designed and produced the 22 cards of the major arcana of the tarot. And the sales of that are going well. And the next logical step for me is to design the rest of the tarot deck and to keep going that way. So it feels like I have completed something on several different levels. And now I feel that I can address what it is that I can give back to the collective, what it is that is there something that I can do to help? So I'm interested in doing that. I'm interested in doing some work that is eco-themed. And yeah, I hope that answers your question.
She says it does. Maybe some other questions from the audience?
Hello. Hi, I am Damir. I was also yesterday at your presentation at the Academy. My question would be, did you ever feel the pull towards interpreting your stories in different media, especially in the digital age today, where images are very easily moved, so to say, made animated, like either animation or some other interpretation, or even as you worked before, installations in space or something? Thank you.
Thank you. I have thought about animating some of the work. although it's a little bit difficult. I have thought about doing stop animation from the reparation, perhaps, by making the puppets, which I sort of like the work of Jan Schwankmeyer and Brothers Quay. So yes, I've been thinking about that, and I've also been thinking about doing a video game out of my Zorka stories, which are, you know, it's a tragic comic story, and I don't know, I could do it. I am very much open at this point. I know that Fatherland was presented at the Berlin Film Festival event, book to screen, and then my agent presented Fatherland to film producers and directors, and nothing really came out of it, but it kind of got me thinking. Fatherland I would definitely see as a film, not an animation, but as a film, and it would only make sense that it would be a co-production between the countries where the story takes place, like Croatia, Serbia, and Canada, and France as well, yeah.
Maybe some other questions? From the audience. Okay, no, then I have a couple of questions for you myself. Your comics seem to be a bit therapeutical. For you, for some people who are involved in a similar situation, did you find it therapeutical yourself? But also yesterday you said that always when you were giving an advice to one of the students, that always if someone deals with something tragic, that it's better to do this artwork with one leg out of the door. So
yeah,
why, especially if it is therapeutical to draw something like that?
It depends on what stage you're at in your healing journey. And if I remember correctly, yeah, I was talking about narratives that are based on traumatic experiences. I told my student that I was working with, who worked on a story that was inspired, maybe that's a bad word, that was based on a traumatic experience. I told her two things. One thing, to definitely look for a therapist while going through the process, and which she did. She ended up finding a therapist that she would see once a week. And the second thing that I told her, and I would tell anybody who's working with any material that's based on deep trauma, is to give yourself freedom to walk away from the project. Nothing is as important as a mental health. Maybe now is not the right time. Maybe you need to heal more and then tell the story afterwards. Because certain things were healing for me and therapeutic. For example, working in Fatherland, but I have no memory of things that took place in Fatherland. I was witness to the aftershock of the events and how it affected other people. But for example, in the reparation, that story about the abuse that I suffered as a child, I was supposed to write before in form of a graphic novel of 120 pages. And after 2 months, I just could not do it anymore. I ended up suffering from anxiety, and I realized I needed to walk away from it. And this is very important for people to know. People do care. I had two publishers which have signed the contract for this book. And they both, one Italian and one French, and they both said, no problem, Nina, we totally understand. People will meet you where you're at if you're honest and forthcoming and tell them how you're feeling. You have to make sure to take care of yourself first, to listen to your body. maybe put down the project, continue later. What I ended up doing is immediately afterwards, I was commissioned by a French publisher who publishes the work of Franz Masserel to do a 25-page silent comic about any subject. And it was an homage to Masserel's first book, which had 25 images or 25 pages. So what I ended up doing is this allegory of the story that I wanted to tell already. But I also brought in the healing component because at this time, my analysis was coming to an end. So I was like, oh, okay, I want to make a story about what happened, but I also want to make a story about how does one heal from that. And I think that the book delivers that. One heals by reaching within and healing oneself.
Your stories are based on your true experiences, and in a way they're very intimate, but in the other way we could compare especially Fatherland to works of journalistic comic artists or documentarist comic artists such as Joe Sacco. Do you also understand your work in this way?
Yes, there are certain things that I always try to avoid in working with such subjects that have political component, that have emotional component, and that is, I do not like to use sentimentality in my work. I don't like sentimental stuff. My friend Jordan has this really funny thing that he says. It's like, yeah, you could have written, you could have drawn your father on the window going, Papa, It's true. Like, I get some black and white sad film. So I try to be extremely neutral when it comes to the narrative. The second thing is to remain neutral politically, because I believe that the best political work comes from personal experience expressed. And this is where Joe Sacco and I differ. I talk about my personal experiences, and it's easy to read. Like, I just lay down the facts. Like, this is what happened. This is my story. This is a story of my country. This is a story of my family. Draw your own conclusions. I believe that any artist who takes a political stand in the work of art is a propagandist and not an artist. So everybody has a choice. Do you want to be an artist or do you want to be a propagandist? So that's when we talk about art. But Joe Sacco is a journalist foremost, most than anything. So that would not apply to him. But yeah, I try to completely stay away from sentimental stuff because there is nothing cringier than things that are like poorly drawn. And I always think that my work is poorly drawn. I always go from that perspective because I'm very difficult and tough on myself. And I see people going, ha, 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 Papa, it's not like that. So I have to be very careful. Yeah.
Maybe at this point we have time for one short question. No. Okay. I guess we're running out of time. Maybe just a 30-second answer to, that famous saying, everything is political. So in a way, like Bezimena could be like a bit of feminist comic, Fatherland could be a bit of engaged comic, critical comic, politically critical comic. So can you take politics really out of the stories?
No, you can't, but it's about the intent. It's about how you present it. people can read it as political, but you don't necessarily have to present it that way.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for being short. Yeah,
Thank you.
we need to continue with the program. It was we are very happy to have you here. Greetings to Serbia, and maybe we say goodbye with a round of applause for Nina Bunjevac.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you again, and hope to see you next time in person.
Thank you very much. Bye, Ljubljana.
Bye.